The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the fjords with a fury that made even the bravest of Vikings clutch their cloaks tighter. The village of Skarva, nestled between jagged cliffs and the icy embrace of the sea, was no stranger to storms. But this one felt different. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, as if the gods themselves were angry. Eric stood at the edge of the dock, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The storm clouds churned like a cauldron, their dark tendrils reaching down to the sea. His ship, the Seawolf, rocked violently in the harbor, its mast groaning under the strain. The villagers had already retreated to their longhouses, seeking shelter from Thor's wrath. But Eric remained, his jaw set in defiance. "Eric, come inside." Astrid's voice cut through the wind, sharp and urgent. She stood a few paces. Behind him, her long silver-streaked hair whipping around her face. Her staff, carved with runes of protection, glowed faintly in the dim light. "Why should I?" Eric shouted back, his voice barely audible over the storm. "If Thor is so powerful, let him strike me down." Astrid's eyes widened, and she gripped her staff tighter. "Do not tempt the gods, Eric. This storm is their warning." Eric turned to face her, his blue eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with the lightning streaking across the sky. "And what have the gods ever done for us, Astrid? My father prayed to Odin for a bountiful harvest, and what did he get? A blight that wiped out half our crops. My mother begged Freya to spare my sister from illness, and yet she died screaming in her bed. Where were the gods then?" Astrid opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, a deafening crack split the air. A bolt of lightning struck the Seawolf, shattering its mast and setting the deck ablaze. Eric stumbled back, shielding his face from the heat. The villagers, peering out from their longhouses, gasped in horror. "Thor's wrath!" someone cried. "Eric has angered the gods!" Eric straightened, his face pale but determined. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the icy ground, and raised his voice so all could hear. "This is not the work of gods. This is nature, raw and untamed. We have been fools to think we could control it with prayers and sacrifices." Villagers murmured among themselves, their fear giving way to confusion. Astrid stepped forward, her staff glowing brighter. "Eric, you do not understand the consequences of your words. The gods are not to be trifled with." "And yet here, I stand," Eric said, his voice steady, "unscathed. If the gods are so powerful, why do they not strike me down now?" The storm seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. The villagers held theirs too, waiting for the inevitable retribution. But nothing happened. The wind died down. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the clouds began to part. Eric turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out in the sudden silence. "The gods are not our masters. They are not our protectors. We have given them too much power over our lives, and for what? To live in fear of their whims. It is time we take control of our own destiny." The villagers stared at him, their faces a mix of awe and fear. Astrid's expression was unreadable, but her grip on her staff tightened. She knew something Eric did not, something she had seen in her visions. That night, as the villagers huddled around their hearths, the first signs of change began to appear. The runes carved into the doorframes of the longhouses, meant to ward off evil spirits, began to fade. The crops in the fields, already struggling, withered further, and the sea, once teeming with fish, grew eerily calm. Astrid sat alone in her hut, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, seeking the gods' guidance. But the visions that came were fragmented and chaotic. She saw Ragnarok, the end of the world, but it was not as the prophecies foretold. The gods were weakened, their forms flickering like dying flames. The giants, their ancient enemies, loomed large and unstoppable, and in the center of it all stood Eric, his face resolute, holding a runestone that pulsed with an unfamiliar power. Astrid opened her eyes, her heart pounding. She did not know what Eric had unleashed, but she knew one thing for certain. The balance of the world had shifted, and there was no going back. The morning after the storm, the village of Skarva awoke to a world that felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. The runes carved into the doorframes of the longhouses, once glowing faintly with protective magic, had faded to mere scratches in the wood. The villagers gathered in small, uneasy clusters, their whispers carrying on the cold breeze. Eirik stood at the edge of the village, staring out at the sea. The water was as smooth as glass, reflecting the pale grey sky like a mirror. No waves, no ripples, just an endless, unnatural calm. He clenched his fists, his breath visible in the frosty air. This was not the work of gods, he told himself. This was nature, and nature could be understood even if it defied explanation. Behind him, Astrid approached, her staff tapping softly against the frozen ground. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She had spent the night trying to commune with the gods, but her visions had been chaotic and fragmented like shards of a broken mirror. "The runes are fading," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The gods' protection is slipping away. Do you understand what this means, Eirik?" Eirik turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It means the gods never protected us in the first place. We protected ourselves, and now we've stopped." Believing in their power, Astrid shook her head, her silver-streaked hair catching the faint light. "You are wrong. The gods and mortals are bound together. When one falters, so does the other. This is not just about belief, Eirik. This is about balance." Erik's jaw tightened. "Then let the gods prove their worth. Let them show us why we should fear them." Astrid's eyes narrowed. "You are playing a dangerous game. The gods are not to be trifled with, even in their weakened state." Before Eirik could respond, a cry rang out from the village. The two of them turned to see a group of villagers gathered around the central longhouse, their faces pale with fear. Eirik and Astrid hurried over, pushing through the crowd to see what had caused the commotion. There, in the center of the village, square was a runestone. It was ancient, its surface weathered and cracked, but the symbols carved into it were unmistakable. They depicted a figure with a sly grin and eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. It was Loki, the trickster, the god of chaos and deceit. Eirik knelt beside the runestone, running his fingers over the carvings. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't here yesterday." One of the villagers said, his voice trembling. "It just appeared." Astrid's breath caught in her throat. She had seen this runestone in her visions, pulsing with an unfamiliar power. And now, here it was, in the heart of the village, as if it had been waiting for them. "This is no ordinary stone," she said, her voice barely audible. "It is a message, a warning." Eirik stood, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. "Or an opportunity. If the gods are weakened, perhaps it's time we found new allies." Astrid's grip on her staff tightened. "Loki, there's not an ally, Eirik. He is a deceiver, a bringer of chaos. If you align yourself with him, you risk destroying everything." Eirik met her gaze, his expression resolute. "And if we do nothing, we risk the same. The gods have failed us, Astrid. It's time we took control of our own destiny." The villagers murmured among themselves, their fear giving way to uncertainty. Some nodded in agreement with Eirik, while others looked to Astrid for guidance. The rift between them was growing, and Astrid knew it was only a matter of time before it tore the village apart. That night, as the villagers huddled around their hearths, the runestone began to glow. It started as a faint pulse like a heartbeat, but soon the light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the longhouses. Eirik stood before it, his face illuminated by its otherworldly glow. "What are you waiting for?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Show me what you can do." The runestone pulsed once, twice, and then the light exploded outward, engulfing Eirik in its radiance. When it faded, he was gone. Astrid, watching from the shadows, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew where Eirik had gone, to the realm of the gods, to confront them on their own ground. And she knew, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that there was no turning back. When the light from the runestone faded, Eirik found himself standing in a place that defied all logic. The ground beneath his feet shimmered like liquid gold, and the sky above was a swirling tapestry of colors, deep purples, fiery oranges, and icy blues. Trees with silver leaves stretched toward the heavens, their branches heavy with glowing fruit. In the distance, a great hall loomed, its roof thatched with golden straw and its doors carved with intricate runes. Eirik recognized it at once. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where Odin feasted with the bravest warriors. But this was not the Valhalla of legend. The hall seemed dimmer, its light flickering, as if struggling to stay alive. The air was thick with a sense of unease, like the calm before a storm. "So the skeptic has arrived," a voice said, smooth and mocking. Eirik turned to see a figure leaning against one of the silver trees. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and a grin that seemed to dance between mischief and malice. His eyes glinted like emeralds, and his hair was a wild tangle of red and gold. It was Loki, the trickster, the god who had been both ally and enemy to the Aesir. "You," Eirik said, his voice steady despite the unease in his chest. "Who brought me here?" Loki pushed off the tree and sauntered toward him, his movements fluid and predatory. "I merely opened the door. You were the one who stepped through. Tell me, Eirik the skeptic, what do you hope to achieve by challenging the gods?" Eirik squared his shoulders. "I want to prove that we don't need them, that mortals can shape their own destiny." Loki laughed, a sound that echoed through the strange landscape. "Bold words for a mortal. But you're not entirely wrong. The gods are not as powerful as they once were. Belief sustains them, and without it they fade. But tell me, what will you do when the giants come? When the world crumbles because the gods are too weak to hold it together?" Eirik hesitated. He hadn't considered that. His defiance had been born of anger and loss, not a desire to destroy the world. Loki's grin widened. "Ah, I see the doubt in your eyes. You're not as sure as you pretend to be. But that's why I like you, Eirik. You're willing to question, to challenge. That's a rare quality in mortals." Before Eirik could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The sky darkened and a shadow fell over the land. Loki's expression turned serious. "He's coming," Loki said, his voice low. "Odin knows you're here, and he's not pleased." A figure emerged from the shadows of Valhalla, tall and imposing, with a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak of stars. His single eye burned with a fierce light, and his presence filled the air, with a weight that made Eirik's knees buckle. It was Odin the All-Father, the king of the gods. "You dare enter my realm, mortal?" Odin's voice was like thunder, shaking the very ground. "You who have turned your back on the gods?" Eirik forced himself to stand tall. "I came to see the truth for myself, to see if the gods are as powerful as they claim." Odin's eye narrowed. "And what have you seen?" Eirik glanced at Loki, who gave him a sly wink. "I've seen that the gods are not infallible, that they need us as much as we need them." Odin's expression softened, but only slightly. "You are not wrong, mortal. The gods and mortals are bound together. But your defiance has upset the balance. The runes fade, the giants stir, and Ragnarok looms closer than ever. Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Eirik's jaw tightened. "I understand that the gods have failed us, that we've been left to suffer while you feast in your halls. If you want our belief, you must earn it." Odin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. If it is a test you seek, then a test you shall have. But know this, Eirik the skeptic. The path you have chosen is fraught with peril. Not all gods are as forgiving as I." With that, Odin raised his spear, Gungnir, and struck the ground. The world around Eirik dissolved into darkness, and he felt himself falling, tumbling through a void of stars and shadows. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the village of Skarva. The runestone was gone, and the villagers were gathered around him, their faces filled with awe and fear. Astrid pushed through the crowd, her staff glowing faintly. "Eirik, what happened? Where did you go?" Eirik looked at her, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. "I spoke with the gods," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I learned the truth." Astrid's eyes widened. "What truth?" Eirik took a deep breath. "That the gods are not our masters. They are our partners. And if we are, to survive we must find a new way to coexist," the villagers murmured among themselves, their fear giving way to hope. But Astrid's expression remained troubled. "And what of Loki?" she asked. "What role does he play in all this, Eirik?" hesitated. He didn't have an answer. But as he looked out at the sea, now stirring with the first signs of waves, he knew one thing for certain: the game was far from over. The return to Skarva was met with a hushed reverence. The villagers, initially fearful for Eirik's fate, now looked upon him with a newfound respect, mingled with a trace of trepidation. The air, once unnaturally still, now carried the familiar scent of salt water and the distant cry of gulls. The world felt right again, yet fundamentally altered. Eirik, though weary from his otherworldly encounter, stood tall. He held no weapon, no magical artifact, only the weight of his newfound understanding. He addressed the gathered villagers, his voice carrying on the revitalized breeze. "The gods have heard us," he began, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him, traditionalists and skeptics alike. "They acknowledge their part in our suffering, in the imbalance that has plagued our world. But they also see the danger of a world devoid of their influence, a world where Ragnarok inches closer with every fading rune." Astrid stepped forward, her staff now radiating a steady, calm light, different from the chaotic flashes of before. "Eirik speaks the truth. The gods are not our masters, nor are they our enemies. They are intertwined with us, with the very fabric of this world. Our disbelief weakens them, but their absence weakens us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Old man Torvin, a staunch traditionalist who had openly condemned Eirik's initial defiance, spoke, his voice raspy but firm. "So what now? Do we return to the old ways? To blind faith and endless sacrifice?" Eirik shook his head. "No. The gods propose a new covenant, a partnership. We offer them not blind worship, but respect and acknowledgement. We recognize their role in the natural world, in the storms and the harvests, in the flow of life itself. In return, they will guide, not dictate. They will protect, not control." He continued, "We will no longer fear their wrath, but understand their influence. We will build, explore, and thrive, not in spite of the gods, but in harmony with them." Villagers exchanged glances, processing this radical shift. Astrid, ever the seeress, elaborated. "This means reinterpreting the old ways. The runes will still hold power, but their meaning will evolve. We will honor the gods, but not through fear, but through understanding their place in the cosmos and our own." The transition wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. There were debates, disagreements, and lingering doubts. Traditionalists struggled to reconcile the new covenant with generations of ingrained beliefs. Skeptics questioned whether the gods could truly change, but Eirik and Astrid, working together, guided the village, and slowly the new understanding took root. The faded runes on the longhouses began to glow anew, but with a softer, more nuanced light. The sea, once eerily calm, returned to its vibrant, life-filled state. The crops, previously withered, showed signs of renewed growth. Skarva, and eventually the surrounding villages, began to thrive, not under the gods' oppressive rule, but in a balanced partnership. Years passed. Eirik, no longer a warrior, became known as Eirik the Wise. He traveled the fjords, sharing the principles of the new covenant, fostering a spirit of exploration and understanding. Viking longships, once primarily vessels of raid and conquest, now ventured further, driven by curiosity and trade. Knowledge and cultural exchange flourished. The Viking world, without the constant fear of divine retribution, became less violent, more prosperous. Astrid remained in Skarva, her role as seeress evolving. She no longer simply predicted the gods' whims, but interpreted the subtle energies of the world, guiding the villagers in maintaining the delicate balance between the mortal and divine realms. Her visions became clearer, less chaotic, reflecting the newfound harmony. One evening, many years later, Astrid stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The setting sun painted the sky in vibrant hues, reminiscent of the otherworldly realm Eirik had visited. She felt a familiar tingle, a premonition, but different from any she had experienced before. She closed her eyes and saw a fleeting image, the runestone depicting Loki, now lying dormant beneath the rebuilt central longhouse of Skarva. It pulsed, faintly, almost imperceptibly. A whisper carried on the wind reached her ears. The game is not over, merely paused. Astrid opened her eyes, a shiver running down her spine. The new covenant had brought peace and prosperity, but the world was vast, and the forces at play were ancient and complex. Loki's influence, though dormant, was not extinguished. The partnership between mortals and gods was stable, but perhaps like any relationship, it required constant vigilance, constant adaptation. The final shot is a close-up of Astrid's face, her expression a mixture of wisdom, peace, and a hint of underlying concern. The new era had dawned, but the future, like the ever-changing sea, remained full of both promise and potential peril. The story ends, but the saga continues.